Welcome back to Poly 319, Peace and Conflict in the Middle East. It's good to be with you. This is your Monday video lesson, the main lesson for the week. Our topic, Section 2, Orientalism and Colonialism. Let's jump right in. One way to explore these ideas is to separate them out. So, even though the idea of Orientalism is inextricably linked to the realities of colonialism, we can treat them one at a time. We could start with either section. Notice I've color-coded it a bit, the light green for the Orientalism and the light yellow for colonialism. If we wanted, we could start with colonialism, we could jump right in, but I think I want to start with Orientalism. So let's back up and begin there. First though, a quick word about the word itself. What is Orientalism? Well, of course, Orient refers to the East, just as Occident refers to the West. And when we talk about Orientalism, we're not just talking about the Far East or East Asia. The Orient in this context really means non-West, or everything east of the West. And a major focus of Orientalism is the Middle East. Okay, let's take a look. This panel is your main resource for learning about Orientalism in this class. We're going to explore all the sections and subsections here. Before coming to the main content in the middle, that's these 3 points, let's see what else is here, starting with the primer videos. All 3 of these short videos are required. They each answer the question, what is Orientalism? And each one takes a slightly different take or perspective. You should find them concise and engaging, summarizing the topic in ways that supplement and complement the presentation here. And look how nice and short they are too. So make sure you watch those. Now let's back up a level. And where does the idea of Orientalism come from? Mostly it comes from the work of Edward Said. Edward Said coined the term Orientalism. In the process, he advanced literary theory, post-colonial theory, and culture studies. Said applied Michel Foucault's idea of power knowledge to the social construction of culture and the Orient in Western literature and discourse. You don't have to really know what that means. It's a very technical statement, but if you're pursuing social sciences, you're going to need to be familiar with this. Most importantly for our purposes here, Edward Said argued that cultures, indeed civilizations, don't have essences. By essences, we mean unchanging, timeless truths. So cultures, he's arguing, are not simple, homogeneous, singular, enclosed, unchanging. Rather, they're complex, heterogeneous, plural, overlapping, dialogical, and adapting. In other words, cultures blend together. They influence each other. They change. They struggle internally with their own identity. It's not so simple as we are this way and they are that way. If you're interested in going a little bit deeper into Edward Said, take a look here. These are Edward Said's 2 most famous and influential books. You can click on them to bring up Google searches. If you don't want to go so far as to read his books, here's a couple of key YouTube lectures. First one is his classic talk, The Myth of the Clash of Civilizations, where he applies his ideas and offers a critique of Orientalist discourses. And the second video is more of a practical political lecture. He provides a scathing critique of Western foreign policy, particularly in the US war on terror, and particularly Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. Okay, so the idea of Orientalism refers critically to essentializing and othering of non-Western cultures through derogatory and patronizing lenses or filters. What do we mean by that? We can illustrate it by looking here. So here is the Western gaze looking down upon the region. It's not a direct experience, but a filtered representation, filtered through media, discourse, economic and political interests, sets of institutions that just so happen to benefit from distorting the picture by dehumanizing, even blaming the people on the other end, conveniently absolving Western powers of the crimes of their own imperial and colonial conquests. So is it any surprise that the qualities that get ascribed to the region are mostly negative? The region is exotic, backwards, savage, tribal, superstitious, infantile, authoritarian, violent. We could add feminine to this list as well. The region is seen as, in some ways, feminine in the sense of something to be seized and possessed as a prize, feminine to be dominated and controlled. Adding a little bit to our understanding, the idea of Orientalism is a way of imagining, describing, diminishing non-Western cultures in ways that are conducive to domination. So it's not just mischaracterizing the region, but it's mischaracterizing with a purpose. We can see this visualized right here in culture. Have you seen Jeff Dunham's hilarious Ahmed the Dead Terrorist ventriloquist bit?
No, Ahmed? No, it's Ahmed. That's what I said. No, you said Ahmed. It's Ahmed.
Have you seen that movie Team America by the makers of South Park?
Durka, Muhammad Jihad.
Have you seen True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
This apparently is the same group which just detonated a nuclear bomb in the Florida Keys.
Crimson Jihad will rain fire on one major U.S. city each week.
I made that up.
Have you seen Back to the Future?
What do you think? The Libyans! Holy sh!
So in media depictions, the Middle East and people from the Middle East are constantly depicted as backwards, barbarian, or violent, or exotic and mysterious. Now, have Muslim extremists blown themselves up for political causes? Are Arab dictators not sometimes outrageous? Have there not been terror groups and terror attacks? Of course. But this is about a selective filter, what gets through and what doesn't. And what doesn't is all the normalcy of Arab and Muslim life. What doesn't get through is the long-standing legacy of Western imperialism and colonialism in the region. What doesn't get through is the far greater violence inflicted by the West on the peoples of the Middle East. We'll see in a few minutes some historical examples of what that violent Western colonialism looks like. Also, show me a conflict in the world that hasn't produced violent attacks, extremist leaders, and even terrorism, right? Think about the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, waged armed struggle against the British for colonizing Ireland for many, many years. In Colombia, the FARC. In Sri Lanka, in South Asia, the Tamil Tiger suicide bombers. Even Japan has seen extremist groups, for example, launching chemical weapon terror attacks on Tokyo's subway system. So the Muslim Middle East doesn't have a monopoly on terrible violence in politics. Though this region in particular has seen some more direct and brutal oppression than most parts of the world, by foreign powers and by local powers. So we might expect to see an all-around increase in violence. But on the subject of violence, if we really want to point fingers, Europeans themselves have carried out the worst political violence in human history. I don't just mean their empires and genocidal policies around the world, including quite close to home here, like I'm thinking about Turtle Island. The Europeans inflicted some of the most brutal military violence in history on themselves, and twice. It's called World War I and World War II. If some faraway alien race were to look down on Earth through a telescopic filter, if they wanted, they could depict Europe as nothing but a destructive cancer. Imagine the Dark Ages, the Spanish Inquisition, Industrial War, firebombing whole cities, killing hundreds of thousands in single attacks, gas chambers, wiping out millions of people. Yeah, we could make Westerners look pretty irredeemable. Of course, it's a bit more complex than that. And for all the terrible qualities, there's always victims. We need to remember. There's always opposition. There's always resistance. There's always principled leadership. There's always alternative models. So too, the people of the Middle East are more than the violence we are selectively fed. A violence which, by any reasonable comparison to the West, seems relatively minor. And it's not just culture per se. This is a political phenomenon. Let's take a look at a few quotes here. George Bush, at the beginning of the US War on Terror, famously said, "They hate us for our freedoms," completely erasing the history of military intervention, colonialism, occupation, exploitation, resource theft, but they hate us for our freedoms. In fact, in a rare moment of humor, Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden once mocked the idea that the Middle East hates the West for its freedoms. After 9/11, he said, "If we hate the West for its freedoms, why then didn't we attack Sweden?" Alluding to the fact that it's about policy. Here's a quote from a Princeton University scholar, Bernard Lewis, who was one of the leading experts on the Middle East for the second half of the 20th century. And he's been the subject of much critique, especially by Edward Said. But listen to what he says. This hatred goes beyond hostility. It becomes a rejection of Western civilization as such. Not only what it does, but what it is, and the principles and values that it practices and professes. These are indeed seen as innately evil. He's saying they see us as evil. And those who promote or accept them, us, are the enemies of God. Now, it's not to say that there are not radical extremists who indeed hold such views, but to paint with a broad brush, to categorize a whole region by these worst attributes of the few, is the problem with Orientalism. While Bernard Lewis doesn't have much of a platform anymore, we still see it, for example, with Bret Stephens. Remember that name because we're going to see him in a video, a New York Times columnist who has repeatedly used the phrase, the disease of the Arab mind. Recently, in fact, Donald J. Trump called for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. I think Islam hates us, as if the whole region is one thing and one way. So we're getting a sense that Orientalism is a series of lenses and filters that really frame the region in ways that excuse and apologize for Western domination. Finally, another way to think about Orientalism is that it projects negative, inferior qualities onto distant others, while identifying the self-group as positive, superior. So they become our opposites. What do I mean here? Let's look at a few examples. West over East, us over them. These opposites are built into Western imaginaries of Eastern and Western identities. Remember, it's not just a social discursive construction of the other, it's also social discursive construction of us in quotes. And binary oppositions are the simple and dangerous mechanism for seeing the world this way. So notice all the quote positive unquote terms in these dichotomies are identified with the West, and all the negative or inferior terms are projected onto the East. And these binaries are not only sets of opposites, they're hierarchies, with the terms on the left of each pair superior or in control. We are civilized, they are savage. We are democratic, they are authoritarian. We peaceful, they violent. Rational over emotional. We are scientific, they are superstitious. We have discipline, they are lazy. We have the masculine qualities, they have the feminine. We are adults, they are children. In this paradigm, supporting dictators that we like, or invading countries of the region to control their resources, not only can we excuse it, but it becomes a noble enterprise, even like a stoic responsibility, a necessary lesser evil, the white man's burden. Well, we don't want to control them, but we must. It's for their sake. They need it. The alternative is far worse. They can't be left to themselves. Okay, so that's our overview of the idea of Orientalism. Let's back up now and go into the more material history of colonialism. We can just click this button here and it'll take us straight over into Middle East colonialism. We're going to explore all the sections and subsections on this panel now. The first thing I want to do is look at some more required videos for this section, and then we'll look at the required reading. And then we'll ask in this section here, what is colonialism? How do we define it? How is it different from and similar to imperialism or settler colonialism, neo-colonialism? Then over here, we're going to walk through some of the periods of colonization of the Middle East in a bit of a wide-ranging history lesson. Then we're going to look a little bit more concretely in this section here at what colonialism means today for much of the Middle East. And we might label that section colonialism in action or neo-colonialism in action. And finally, we're going to end by asking, what is post-colonialism? So let's look at the required videos. All 6 of these videos are required. In the first one, you're going to learn about the scramble for Africa, the so-called scramble for Africa in the late 1800s. This was a period in which the great powers of Europe, especially Britain and France and Germany, looked at Africa and said, okay, how are we going to divide this up between ourselves? A little bit after that period, in the early 20th century, we had the Sykes-Picot Agreement. One of you asked last week about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Here it is in a couple of short videos. In a nutshell, it was a secret agreement between the British and the French. A secret agreement that they struck during World War I, where they said, once this war is over, you and I are going to carve up the Ottoman Empire. We're going to take the different parts of the Middle East for ourselves, and they made this agreement in secret, even though they had promised independence to many of the peoples in that same region. The fourth video is going to introduce you to the Balfour Declaration. In the fifth video, you're going to see some of the ways that America's energy obsession, oil, has wrecked the Middle East. And finally, the sixth video I want you to watch is a little bit of Noam Chomsky talking about colonialism. Now, you might think this is a lot of required videos to watch, and maybe it is, but don't forget that the reading load for this section is really low. Because the reading load is so low, I've increased the amount of videos that you're required to watch. As you know from your course outline, which details all the readings for each of the sections, there's just one reading for section 2. And that's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on colonialism. It's an excellent article. Make sure you give it a careful read. It's the primary required reading for this section. But I'm also adding a little bit more from your course glossary of wars and treaties, linked here, available on Course Spaces. I want you to read the following entries that I've written. On the French-Algerian War, on the Suez War, on the UN General Assembly Declaration on Decolonization, on the US-led war on terror, the US-led war in Afghanistan, and the Iraq War. These are the main entries that have to do with colonialism from our glossary of wars and treaties. I'll be requiring additional entries in future sections, but of course you can read that whole document anytime you want, and you're very strongly encouraged, remember, to keep that document handy as you're doing your required readings or studying. That will help make sense of some of these complex issues. So there are the required videos and readings. Now, let's jump into what is colonialism. It may seem intuitively obvious. We all know what colonialism is, right? Well, it's a little bit complicated. Let's try to define it. There is no single accepted definition, and it has some overlap with a few other terms, but I think we can define it this way. It refers to foreign domination and exploitation. It overlaps with imperialism and settler colonialism and neo-colonialism, but it can be distinguished. So colonialism is a type of imperialism, and it seeks to extend its institutions into other parts of the world, to subjugate and expropriate other peoples and lands, especially to extract gains from native markets and labor and resources. And we can break that down like this. Imperialism commands parts of the world. It says, hey, you, do this or else. Colonialism commands and remakes parts of the world. It says, hey, you, we're in charge, and you should be more like us. Or make way for our forms of governance and industry. Open those markets, open those mines and those oil fields. Settler colonialism commands, remakes, and repopulates parts of the world. It says all that, and also, by the way, we're moving in. So what does neo-colonialism mean? Neo-colonialism refers to colonial structures that persist after the formal period of colonization. So even though many places have been technically decolonized, there are economic structures and power structures that remain that are very much the legacy of colonialism, and we call those neo-colonial. This isn't the only way of thinking about what these terms mean, but I think this is a useful way of breaking it down. And we could give examples of each, right? Including close to home. Canada and the US were founded as settler colonial states. In much of the Middle East, what we had was rampant imperialism, but also colonialism. The amount of settler colonialism in the Middle East was a little bit less. The major example was the French in Algeria. The French didn't just try to control Algeria. They didn't just try to control and exploit Algeria. They tried to move in and make it really part of France. On this slide, or set of slides, I've put together some of the periods of Western colonization in the Middle East. First, I want you to look at this timeline. It spans from about 1800 all the way to today, marking the turn of the centuries and the two world wars. The major transformations of the Middle East happened around the two world wars. The red bars under the timeline tell you approximately the years of colonization, sometimes with a lighter color red showing softer periods of colonization. So in Egypt, we have a big blip right around 1800. That's France, led by Napoleon, trying to conquer the country. In 1798, modern European colonization of the Middle East begins with Napoleon's short-lived conquest of Egypt. And I've put the years here in red, just to visually link it with the red portions of the timeline. Take a look here at these paintings from the time period, celebrating the episode, the Battle of the Pyramids. Now, almost 100 years later, the British show up, equipped with an industrial navy, steam power, warships, and really big cannons. Britain invaded because at the time, they had a good relationship with the ruler, but the ruler was facing a rebellion, and Britain intervened to protect and prop up the ruler of the day. So for this period, from 1882 to 1922, Britain occupied the country militarily, and the Egyptian government was a client regime. Not very popular with the local population, but the people couldn't do much about it because the British army could crush their resistance. Here's a couple images depicting soldiers lounging about. So what changed around 1922? Well, after World War I ended, in 1919, the Egyptians launched a new mass popular uprising. People filled the streets for weeks and months on end, in combination with organized non-cooperation and campaigns of civil disobedience. The Egyptians were actually able to win their independence from Britain. Sort of. The British seemed to cave in to the Egyptian demands. Egypt was to become formally independent, and the British military left most of the country. Egyptians were allowed to elect their own parliament. But in the period after 1922, the colonialism never really went away. It diminished. The British kept some forces in parts of the country, like the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a shortcut from Europe to India. Without it, ships have to sail all the way around Africa to make the same journey. So the British continued to occupy the Egyptian Suez Canal, and they also exercised a lot of sway over the Egyptian economy, which the Egyptians came to resent. And Egypt never became fully independent until 1952. Independent not only in name, but in reality as well, when the Egyptian military staged a coup of the country's government and expelled the British for good. Now, it was after World War II, and the British were already winding down their empire, but the revolutionary military regime of Egypt sealed the deal. And the military government, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, was wildly popular. Nasser was one of the most popular leaders not just in the region, but in the world. This same military regime founded by Nasser is still the military regime ruling Egypt today. Of course, it's changed over time, and by most accounts today, the military regime has become increasingly corrupt and increasingly oppressive, and its leadership is nowhere near as popular as it once was, for example, back in Nasser's day. This is Nasser here. He was beloved in Egypt, beloved by most Arabs, seen as a champion not only of Egyptian independence, but of Arab independence more broadly. More than any other Arab leader, Nasser stood up for the Palestinians. He also stood up against Israel. He was also beloved by third world movements around the world, seen as a champion of decolonization generally. And here he is on the cover of Time magazine. So let's look a little bit more at the rest of North Africa. We could tell similar stories about Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Between 1884 and 1956, Spain and France colonized Morocco. In Algeria, from 1830 until 1962, France occupied the country, actually extended the French border to simply include the whole country of Algeria. It moved its own population in. This was settler colonialism. As it says here, Algeria was probably the most long-lasting and brutal episode of European colonization in the Middle East. Historians have described the French policy as, at times, genocidal. Whole parts of the country were burned down. Let me read a little bit from a book by John Chalcraft. You can read along if you like. The French were prepared to go to extreme lengths to destroy the resistance. and they sought to achieve submission through engineering economic insecurity and subsistence crises, cutting tribes from their grazing grounds, and so on. These policies created the conditions for the famine of 1867-68, which involved some 800,000 deaths. The genocidal violence faced by Algerians under what the French called colonization without restraint is still little appreciated in the English-speaking world. All the villages, some 200 in number, were burnt down, all the gardens destroyed, all the olive trees cut down. That's a French general bragging about destroying 200 villages. And Chalcraft continues, as historians now know, almost half the Algerian population was killed directly or indirectly by the French. Now, the Italians may not have been in Libya as long as the French were in Algeria, but the colonialism was every bit as deadly. Reading from the same author, Italians saw their foes as barbarians and little more than beasts and treated them accordingly, sometimes referring to the whole of Cyrenaica as a poisoned organism. Cyrenaica is the large eastern portion of Libya. Starting in late 1923, as the Italians were unable to locate and destroy the Bedouin armed groups, they turned to the indiscriminate killing of those found in Bedouin camps. They destroyed herds and food stores, bombed and strafed camps, and dropped poison gas on some of them. They targeted the families and their herds. These measures only stiffened the will of the Bedouin to resist. Rather than change policy, the Italians built from 1930 a series of concentration camps that would eventually contain over 100,000 people. By the summer, the entire population of Cyrenaica was systematically rounded up and marched into barbed wire encampments, where they were kept imprisoned. Chalcraft continues, perhaps between half and 2/3 of the Cyrenaican population died between 1911 and 1932, most in the concentration camp system. This was, in the words of the Italian historian Del Boca, genocide. So, did you know that Italy did those things to Libya? The point here is not to memorize any of these details, but to actually get a sense of what colonialism meant for much of the region. It's not just a word or an abstraction, it has serious and devastating consequences these countries are still dealing with today. So we've talked about parts of North Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and as the note at the bottom says, this should be seen in the context of the scramble for Africa, which we learned about, or you will learn about in the short video from our video list. Remember right here, what was the scramble for Africa? Now, if we go down one more tab away from North Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula, things look a little different. Here we don't see such extreme colonization. But this part of the world was also much less populated, much less developed, and didn't really have any resources to speak of until the discovery of oil. The most notable aspect of this part of the world was, first of all, the British establishment of the Trucial States, which eventually became Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, including Dubai and Abu Dhabi, today some of the wealthiest cities in the Middle East. The second noteworthy aspect of this slide is the rise of the Saudi dynasty around 1915 to 1927, which came to power with some British support. Okay, let's look away from the Arab world for a moment and click on Iran. Iran was never fully colonized by European powers, though it was consistently intervened upon and meddled with various European powers supporting various governments or helping to overthrow others, at least until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Here's a couple of maps just to give a sense of British and Russian influence in the country at different times. The details here are not super important for our purposes. Now, let's say a few words about the wartime promises during the First World War that would shape the region for the next 100 years. World War I was the most formative period of the modern Middle East, specifically with regard to the defeat and the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the takeover of many of its territories by Western powers. During the war, Britain made three major promises to three different parties. First, in the Hussein McMahon correspondences, this was a series of written letters around 1915. The British promised Arab leaders independence if they turned against the Ottomans and joined the British side of the war. And the Arabs did rise up against the Ottomans, joining the British war effort. Have you ever heard of Lawrence of Arabia? That's a story about how the British got the Arabs to join their side. But after the war, spoiler alert, the British did not fulfill their promise of independence, and to this day the Arabs have never forgotten. The second wartime promise that the British made was a promise to the French, a secret agreement with the French known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after Mr. Sykes and Monsieur Picot. And the agreement was that once the war was over, the French and the British would divide the Ottoman territories up between themselves. Never mind that Britain had already promised independence to the Arabs. Third, complicating the matter, in 1917, the British promised the Jewish national movement a homeland in Palestine, in the Balfour Declaration. Remember, at this time, there is no Israel, no Jewish state. For some background on Zionism, back up to section 1, to the key dates section, where we briefly discuss some of these developments about Zionism and the creation of Israel. And we'll revisit it in our next section, section 3, on Israel-Palestine. So to recap here, the British promised independence to the Arabs, they promised to split the region with France, and they promised a home for the Jews in Palestine. 3 seemingly incompatible promises regarding more or less the same part of the world. There's an old joke about the Promised Land being the over-promised land. Why did Britain make these promises? Well, in each case, it was to bolster its war objectives. At the time, it still wasn't clear if the Allies were going to win against Germany and the Ottomans. So the British promised anything they could to anyone who would listen that they thought might give them an edge in the war. So they promised the Arabs that if they won, the Arabs would have independence after the war. And they made promises to international Jewry, apparently hoping to get some support from influential and often affluent Jewish communities around the world. Well, of course, the Allies did win the war, and in the aftermath of the war, the mandates were established. So Britain and France do proceed to carve up the former Ottoman territories along with the German colonies, and they broke them into zones of quote-unquote temporary colonial rule, deeming the local populations not ready for independence. The new colonial administrations were legalized in international law as the mandates under the 1919 League of Nations Charter and the 1920 San Remo International Conference. The mandate borders that the colonial powers drew are the borders that persist today. This is the map that emerged from World War I. Not immediately, but within a few years of 1919, this was the map. And this is the map to this day, mostly. There's a few small changes, but mostly this is the map as we're familiar with it today. So at the time, these countries are demanding independence, but they've got these colonial governments administering them saying, you're not quite ready for independence, but maybe soon. And eventually, over the years and the coming decades, and within about the next 50 years, each of the mandates would formally become free, independent, except for one. That takes us to Palestine. Christmas, 1917. Britain takes Jerusalem from the Ottoman Empire. It was a major turning point in the war. This was the beginning of the British mandate for Palestine. From 1917 on, Britain would control the country right up until 1948. During this period of British colonial control, the British mostly suppressed Arab nationalism. Remember, all the people of the different mandates were demanding independence for this whole period. In the case of the Palestine Mandate, the Arabs were ultimately denied an independent Palestine. During the same period, the British were mostly supporting Jewish nationalism. So many Arabs felt like the British were selectively fulfilling their promises, supporting the promise to the Jewish people, allowing them to build up their institutions, to bring in their populations from Eastern Europe, to begin to develop governance institutions, while denying the same for the Arab population. And here's a little bit of background on Zionism. Since 1896, Jewish Zionists had sought to establish a state in Palestine. And indeed, small Jewish settler communities had started to pop up, especially after 1917, when Britain pledged its support for the movement. There were indigenous Jewish communities in the country. They were very small, and we'll talk a little bit about that more another time. And ultimately, it would be 1948, when the British finally left the country, that the Jewish Zionists declared the independence of the State of Israel. Ever since 1948, the Palestinian Arabs have been stateless. Here's a couple of pictures. This is British forces during the course of suppressing the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, when the Arab population rose up to demand their own independence. And here's a little snapshot of the famous Judenstaat, the book that sort of launched the Zionist movement by Theodor Herzl, and a photo taken during the statement of the Declaration of Independence of Israel in 1948. You see the Star of David in the background, which became the flag of Israel, and you see a portrait of Theodor Herzl himself. And what does it look like today in parts of the country? Well, here you see a Palestinian protester peering over the Israeli separation barrier. So more on this with our next section next week. Let's move forward now a little bit more quickly. Let's look at what happened in Greater Syria. So this region of Greater Syria, let's just take a quick look at it. Here's the map, became a French mandate. And it was called the French Mandate of Syria and Lebanon. And this map that you see here is basically Syria today, minus this green portion, which became Lebanon. This part of the Middle East, of course, was also part of the Ottoman Empire, and the mandate was established by the French in 1920, and it would last until the mid-1940s. During that whole time, much of the country was in rebellion. And at the same time, the French deployed classic divide and conquer strategies, pitting different regions and different sects against each other, and privileging Christian minority communities into positions of power, all of which served to keep the country somewhat divided and incapable of a unified opposition. Moving forward now into Iraq. Iraq was a British mandate. From 1917, again, that crucial turning point year of World War I, just as the British took Jerusalem from the Ottomans in that year, they also took over Mesopotamia, as that part of the world was called, and this was part of the region that the British had promised the Arabs independence in. But the British stayed on, as they did everywhere else, and they established this mandate. And in this mandate, they combined 3 previous Ottoman provinces into one new country, Iraq. And they put members of a Sunni Arab group in leadership positions in the country, even though the Sunni were the minority. And this alienated a larger majority of the population, which was mostly Shia Muslims, and also the Kurdish peoples of the north. We can recognize this again as a kind of divide and conquer strategy. But the British mandate was thoroughly unpopular here as it was everywhere else it was tried. And the people rose up almost from the first day that the British took over. And soon the British found themselves in a quagmire. In 1920, there was a mass armed uprising, which the British eventually crushed with force. And here's a map. This shows us what the country of Iraq looks like and the 3 provinces that were combined into the new country. Also, I found this fascinating political cartoon from 1922 from a British newspaper called The Mesopotamian Quicksand. And it shows a sense that, first of all, there's this Orientalist trope about quicksand, this mysterious, deadly part of the terrain of the Middle East, where if you step into it, you'll be stuck and you'll never be able to get out. But it's the British taxpayer who's going down, footing the bill, as the cartoon says, for £50 million a year to keep up the British mandate there. So it was unpopular in Iraq and perhaps had a degree of unpopularity in Britain as well. For the Iraqis, nominal independence would come in 1932, and de facto independence would not come until the 1950s. And you'll notice I've added the 2003 to 2011 US occupation of Iraq here as well, because that is a part of Iraq's colonial history. In this case, with the Americans trying to remake the government, again with massive resistance from the get-go. In both 2003 and in 1919, the imperial power of the day promised the Iraqis would welcome them with open arms as liberators. They would be throwing flowers at their troops in the streets. Of course, as you can imagine, nobody likes being invaded and occupied, and there was massive bloody resistance. Let's go forward one more tab. Anti-colonial resistances. Here I just want to quickly provide in one snapshot an overview of the many and various kinds of resistance that emerged over this whole period. The Iraqi insurgency against the British, the Egyptian mass popular uprising. In Palestine, there was Jewish and Arab unrest through much of the period. In Egypt, the Free Officers' Revolution, in which the military came to power and threw out the last remnants of the British colonial influence, the Algerian War for Independence. In the second half of the 20th century, the Armed Palestine Liberation Organization, various wars against Israel by various states in the region. The Iranian Revolution itself was a form of anti-colonial resistance, finally putting an end to the very direct meddling and interference from Western countries. As well, after 1979, increasingly we see Islamist militant jihadi movements. Beginning in the late 80s, the Palestinian uprisings, or intifadas, the Iraqi insurgency after the Americans invaded, and some of the worst examples of terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. In some ways, all of these were reactions to colonial and neo-colonial histories and ongoing histories. In fact, in the case of the Islamic State, in 2014, one of the first videos they produced was a video of an Islamic State bulldozer knocking down the sign that demarcated the border between Iraq and Syria. And in the video, they said, "This is the end of Sykes-Picot." What they're saying there was your 1916 Sykes-Picot agreement to impose your own borders on the region, it's over. So much of what the Islamic State was trying to do was a reaction against the very state system established by European powers in the 20th century. I do want to point out here an interesting note. Almost all of this resistance over this whole period was secular nationalist resistance, mostly leftist or Marxist. The Islamist resistance really only takes a lead role after 1979. It's interesting to point out because today we think so many of the political movements, the political parties, and the resistance has this Islamist overtone. Well, that's a relatively new feature. Okay, so let's go forward once more. Decolonization leading to independence. In this slide, let's just wrap up this subsection by saying a few words about the processes of decolonization. Formal steps towards independence began immediately after World War I. After all, the mandates were always supposed to be temporary, and they accelerated after World War II, when the European powers were no longer so dominant. Yet the colonial powers kicked and screamed the whole way, trying to cling to power till the bitter end, and only leaving, in some cases, after long and bloody liberation struggles. Through the period of decolonization and after, the UN, the United Nations, became a major arena of anti-colonialism, as more and more newly independent nations joined the organization. And by the 1960s, most countries of the Middle East were formally independent. However, even after independence, some colonial power structures remained across the region and remain to this day, especially but not only economic structures. And we call this neo-colonialism. Not formal or direct colonialism, but informal and indirect forms of influence and control, and sometimes overt military interventions. So imperialism never really went away, even if the formal periods of colonization mostly came to a close. And you'll notice here, as an optional resource, I've included something that's really interesting to play with. This gives a different take on visualizing the periods of colonization of the region. It's a YouTube video with a color-coded map with each second of the video depicting a year in history. And it shows the European powers come and go and where their influence spreads. So that's just something you might want to play with if you have some time. It's optional. You don't need to explore that. So we talked about some of these formal periods of colonization, but what do we really mean by neo-colonialism? Let's take a look at this section. Neo-colonialism in action. And I've broken this down into the following headings: resource extraction, supporting repressive regimes, supporting insurgencies and coups, military coups, and direct military interventions, as well as economic sanctions. Resource extraction refers primarily to oil. So I've included two required videos here: Who Controls the World's Oil and Oil Wars, America's Energy Obsession. Just a couple of short videos give some more background and more exploration of the important topic of oil. Under the second heading, supporting repressive regimes. This has probably been the major way that the West has maintained control over the region for many years up until today. And it's basically, if you find a government who's willing to work with you, a government who plays by your rules, a government that will cooperate with your security policies, a government that will cooperate with your economic policies, with international systems of trade, with your multinational corporations. And when you find a government that plays along, you support them. You give them aid. You give them military weapons. You train their security forces, very often against the wishes of the local population. And over time, you end up with a very authoritarian government that doesn't have any democratic legitimacy, but is being propped up by neo-colonial power structures. And there are some examples of that. In fact, there are many examples of that. If we look at this little list, the Saudi dynasty has enjoyed support from Western governments since 1938. Here's a photo of President George W. Bush holding hands with the King of Saudi Arabia. In Iran, the West supported the Shah, or the king, especially through this period of 1953 to 1979. In the occupied Palestinian territories, Western countries have supported the Israeli occupation, providing military aid and diplomatic cover. In Egypt, ever since President Sadat into the presidency of Mubarak and the current President Sisi, these presidents have all enjoyed lots of support from Western countries. At times, these presidents were deeply unpopular and would have fallen if it were not for the support of the West. To this day, Egypt is the second largest recipient of US aid after Israel. The Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara has been supported by Western governments since the 1970s, against the wishes of the people of Western Sahara. In Iraq, before we were opposed to Saddam Hussein, he was our ally in the region. Here in this photo, Saddam Hussein is shaking hands with Donald Rumsfeld in the 1980s. The corrupt president of Tunisia, Ben Ali, was supported by the West until the Arab uprisings of 2011. The president of Yemen was supported by the West until the Arab uprisings of 2011. And the West has been supporting the increasingly corrupt Palestinian Authority in the occupied West Bank, whose democratic legitimacy ran out many years ago, yet the authority is still being supported. So resource extraction is one form of colonialism in action today, neo-colonialism. Supporting repressive governments is another form of neo-colonialism today. Supporting insurgencies and coups is another. In some ways, this is the flip side of the previous point about supporting repressive regimes. As long as the government is willing to play by Western rules, they get Western support. But if the government is not playing by Western rules, if they try to go their own way, if they try to develop their own economic policy or their own regional policy, that's when, unfortunately, Western governments have had a tendency to support not just opposition movements in those countries, but actual insurgencies and sometimes military coups. So, for example, the West supported multiple coups in Syria and Iraq in the 1940s and 50s. That means it's not clear which way the country is going, but there's one particular faction on the ground that is our guy. They're playing by our rules, so we arm them, we prop them up, we get them to overthrow the government. And then when they take power, they become a client of Western governments. This was the case in Iran in 1953. Iran had tried to nationalize its oil, so the West supported a military coup that toppled the elected government and installed the Shah. We've seen this a couple times now. In Afghanistan, the West supported Mujahideen resistance, including extremist Salafi jihadis that would later become Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. That was throughout most of the 1980s. In Algeria in 1992, popular democratic elections looked like it was going to overturn the government, who was an ally of the West, so Western governments supported the Algerian government in stopping the elections. They basically pulled the plug on the elections because they were going to lose, and it launched a civil war in the country, and they did this with Western support. In 2006, the West supported a partial coup against the Hamas 2006 election victory in Palestine. So Hamas wins these elections, but instead of being allowed to form government, the US and Israel basically armed and supported a coup by the ruling establishment to keep Hamas from taking power and preserving the rule of the corrupt Palestinian Authority. We'll come back to the politics of Palestine next week. In Syria, between 2012 and 2016, possibly ongoing, Western governments, as well as many governments in the region, have been supporting extremist Salafi jihadi movements, trying to topple the government. And in 2013, Western governments supported, or at least did not oppose and gave their tacit approval to, an Egyptian military coup. This was right after the Arab Spring. The Arab uprisings led to the overthrow of a number of dictatorships, including in Egypt, and for the first time in Egypt's modern history, there were democratic elections, and a new government was voted into power, led by the Muslim Brotherhood. This was a break in the long history of Egypt's military rule. And for a year, the Muslim Brotherhood ruled the country, but in 2013 there was a military coup where the army stepped in and took back power, toppling the elected government and throwing them in prison. Shortly after, the West normalized ties with Egypt and resumed aid to the country, even though that's a violation of international law because the government had come to power through a military coup. So these are just some examples of Western powers supporting insurgencies and military coups in countries whose governments they don't like. Sometimes the hand of Western powers is not always obvious in insurgencies and coups, and sometimes it plays a minor role. But in cases of direct military intervention, there's no question. So there's a lot of examples. Here on this slide, I've just collected the major occurrences of military intervention led by Western powers across the Middle East, or the greater Middle East, because we're including Afghanistan here. Egypt, the Suez Crisis of 1956. This was an incident in which England conspired with France and with Israel to use military force to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt. Remember that Egypt had only recently gained its full independence under Nasser and the military regime. But just a few years later, England thought it could take back control of the canal. The scheme failed partly because the US intervened, because at the time the US was sort of preoccupied with Cold War politics. Another major intervention was the 1991 Gulf War. This was one that actually had a lot of international legitimacy because it had the backing of the UN Security Council. At the time, Iraq had invaded and occupied neighboring Kuwait. And in response, the US ended its friendly relationship with Iraq and led a coalition to liberate Kuwait and throw Iraq out of the country. It's widely viewed as a successful example of military intervention, one of the few. More recently, as part of the War on Terror, US military intervention in Afghanistan since 2001 until today, US military intervention and occupation of Iraq, mostly in this period from 2003 to 2010, when President Obama began the drawdown of US troops. Then in 2011, there was another military intervention in Libya, and this was a concerted international effort. Parties invoked the R2P doctrine, the responsibility to protect doctrine. This is at the height of the Arab Spring. The Arab people are demanding freedom and dignity, a better government, and they took to the streets. Well, in Libya, the government was using extremely repressive, deadly repression to crush the uprising. And Western countries led an intervention to protect the people that ultimately became a regime change war. To this day, Libya is in a state of anarchy and civil war, largely as a result of this military intervention. Then, of course, there's the anti-ISIS intervention, mostly from 2014 until about 2017, but still continuing. And of course, the Israeli wars on Lebanon and on Gaza. And we'll talk more about those interventions next week. Economic sanctions is another pervasive form of neo-colonialism in the region. For example, the US, the EU, and other countries, including Canada, have frequently imposed economic sanctions for political objectives, sometimes very extreme and in pursuit of regime change. Think about Cuba, which has been under embargo and sanctions by the US for many years. But with economic sanctions, populations typically bear the brunt, and the regimes rarely fall. So here are some examples. Recently in the news, the Syria sanctions. These are increasingly strict sanctions against trade with Syrian industry and against supporting or aiding the Syrian government, including reconstruction efforts. So even though the civil war is winding down, ISIS is mostly defeated, the government is not really able to fully restore control or have a kind of domestic legitimacy, in part because they're being crippled by economic sanctions. This is an example of where the Syrian government has not been a client state. And in part, this explains why, if we back up for a moment, this explains why the West has supported the insurgency against the Syrian government since the Arab uprisings began. Because the Syrian government had never been a full cooperative ally of the West. So when the Arab Spring broke out and the insurgency started, the West, along with other countries in the region, were all too happy to funnel weapons into the country to try to destabilize the government in the hopes that it would fall. So the Syria sanctions are a very important issue in the news today, but so are the Iranian sanctions. The Trump administration has imposed very severe economic sanctions, even though Iran has been in compliance with the international nuclear agreement that it signed in an arrangement led by Barack Obama. So Trump pulls out of this nuclear agreement and imposes sanctions on Iran. Other examples include the sanctions against Iraq throughout most of the 1990s until military invasion toppled the country, includes the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip, the Yemen blockade at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Since 2015, Saudi Arabia, with Western support, has imposed a land, sea, and air blockade, plus ongoing brutal aerial bombing, making Yemen one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. So these are some of the ways that neo-colonialism continues to exercise influence over the region long after the period of decolonization, through arrangements of resource extraction, by supporting oppressive governments who act in favor of Western policies, and by supporting insurgencies and coups against governments that don't, by periodically launching direct military interventions, sometimes in the name of international law, or sometimes in the name of protecting the local population, sometimes in the name of bringing democracy, but almost always with catastrophic effect. And economic sanctions, penalizing trade and economic development in countries that aren't playing by the rules. So we've defined colonialism, we've looked at the formal periods of colonization, we've explored some of the many ongoing ways that neo-colonialism continues to work. Finally, that leaves us with this question: what is post-colonialism? Post-colonialism, it does not really refer simply to the period after decolonization, though sometimes it is used that way. It certainly does not mean that colonialism has ended. It does not mean that we're in a period in history where colonialism no longer exists. Rather, post-colonialism refers to those sets of neo-colonial relations and identities that perpetuate colonial power structures across the decolonized world, often in culture and economics rather than overt politics, though as we've seen, sometimes with pretty direct military power. Post-colonialism refers to literature and research in the humanities and social sciences that explore these relations and identities. So post-colonialism is a whole field of study, and it is heavily indebted to Edward Said's work on Orientalism, which is largely credited with creating post-colonial studies. Post-colonialism emphasizes power relations in discourse, in culture, and in identity. So I've included here an optional video. This is a really nice, concise summary of the idea of post-colonialism. What is it? What are some of the main theoretical aspects of post-colonialism? Where does it come from? Who are some of the major contributors to it? Completely optional, but for those interested in exploring it further, here's a link for you. So, in this lesson, we've explored some of the realities of colonialism. We've done an overview of the idea of Orientalism, and that basically takes care of Section 2, Orientalism and Colonialism. Let's wrap it up here, but this is a link where you can register your questions or comments about this lesson, and we'll see you on Tuesday in our live session. Thank you for your time.